Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, dust slicers, peasants, vassals, minions. I'm a useful idiot. Today I want to talk about Somalia. And I want to talk about Somalia in the context of being the U.S.'s secret little war right now. And I was surprised to find out the scale of what is going on in Somalia. So I feel perfectly comfortable characterizing it as a secret U.S. war. I'm not even sure how secret it is, but it's been going on for the better part of a decade, and now involves a fairly large U.S. presence. And what perked my interest was the last week or so, apparently 24 combat troops, Marines, were sent to Somalia to augment what U.S. presence there is there now. As it turns out, there's a large compound, a CIA station in Mogadishu. It's been there since 2011 at the Aden Ade International Airport. And it's quite the compound with guard towers and quite a military presence. And it's used for training Somali intelligence. And the Somali army is also working with the United States. And ostensibly, the United States works directly with the Somali army and directly with Somali intelligence because the political leaders are too corrupt and untrustworthy. So in essence, America is running a war in Somalia with a proxy army, a proxy Somali intelligence, as well as the usual private contractors slash mercenaries and CIA operatives and now U.S. combat troops. And drones have been active there for a while. There's actually been 172 Somalis killed by drones. And in fact, at one point, there was 146 people killed in just 2 days back in November 2011. And these drones are launched from Ethiopia. So we have airstrikes, we have drones making attacks from Ethiopia, and then we have this compound in Mogadishu. And the reason why I know it goes further back is because there's articles going all the way back to the previous U.S. presence there in 1993, that's been immortalized in the movie Black Hawk Down, U.S. involvement, supposedly a humanitarian effort to go to Somalia and deal with some warlords and deal with the famine. But as I like to do, I want to give a little background into how we got to where we are now, a little bit of background and history of Somalia, and I'll keep it pretty spare this time. The population is about 10 million, and interestingly, mostly Muslim and mostly Sunni, 99.8%. So there's no ethnic rivalry here. There's strictly warlords versus other warlords. And I was surprised there wasn't more African pagan religions, for example. 99.8% Muslim Sunni. And the British and Italians carved out their colonies there during the colonial era. And oddly enough, one of the only successful resistances against the British Empire were the dervishes in Somalia. And the British didn't defeat them until 1920 after World War I with the introduction of air power. And then, of course, by the time we get to World War II, the British are fighting against the Italians. And so the British and Italians use the Somalilands as a battlefield. And then in 1960, the two Somalilands are united in independence. And so Somaliland becomes Somalia in 1960. And what a shocker, by 1969, the original president is assassinated, and a dictator backed by the United States comes to power, Mohammed Siad Barre. And he initially was interested in working with the communists, but ended up facing off against Ethiopia, Cuba, and USSR by 1977. And this is another thing that we see in a lot of these post-colonial countries is the repercussions of the colonial governments essentially propping up one sector of the country or the society and using them against the other part of the country. And of course, they reap all the economic benefits, and we find this in Somalia as well. difficulties caused by the disparate infrastructure development in different British and Italian colonies. So the British would set up more of an infrastructure to invest in the country and the colony. And we find this all over Africa and the Middle East. And Djibouti, incidentally, was formerly French Somaliland. So we had British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, and French Somaliland. French Somaliland became Djibouti, and the other two countries became Somalia as we know it. So, so by 2009, or as I say, the President Mohammed Siad Barre came to power, and he was in power until 1991. So he was a dictator for the better part of 20 some odd years, and that's when the country descended into chaos in 1991, and then the moment immortalized in Black Hawk Down and a U.S. presence was in '93 in Mogadishu. And incidentally, the legend of U.S. presence there is dampened a bit when one considers that 34 U.S. soldiers were killed in Somalia in 1993, but estimates put the Somali dead at somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 for the U.S. presence there. So much for the humanitarian effort, and we had to leave without basically challenging the warlords that we came there to dismantle. And they've been dealing with that situation ever since. And at one point, a U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion took place in 2006. And that's when the country stabilized to a certain degree. But now we are working with basically African Union troops, which includes Ethiopians. We have 6,000 to 10,000 Somalian troops that we are working with, and then we have Somali intelligence that we're working with. And so, so between the CIA collaborating with warlords and U.S.-backed invasion in 2006, and these operations going all the way back to 2004, then that means the U.S. has had a presence in Somalia for the last decade on a pretty substantial scale. And there's no surprise why there would be a substantial scale of U.S. interest in Somalia, even at this point. Most people's perception is that we went in there, we got bit, and then we left. It descended into chaos. But it's actually a little more complex than that. And one reason why the U.S. is not going to leave Somalia behind is that 2/3 of Somalia's resources were already allocated to Conoco, Amoco, Chevron, and Phillips before the president was overthrown and the nation collapsed in 1991. So all those oil companies have major interests in Somalia that they want to have honored. And there's a potential for onshore and offshore oil reserves at about 110 billion barrels. So Somalia could reap some economic benefit from this point being exploited by the West. And so we have all the elements that we have in a lot of these other engagements. We have these proxy armies. We have native armies being pitted against each other. We have insurgencies. We have these post-colonial borders. We have these post-colonial infrastructures all working together to create this host of problems that we see over and over and over again. So to get back to why we can say the scale of this as a war is because if you go back even a couple of years, by 2009, there's massive U.S. arms being shipped into Somalia to arm the Somalia army and also the intelligence operations there. But also in 2010, the U.S. Was involved in a major offensive, and the U.S. provided surveillance, reconnaissance, logistics, and a U.S. official was quoted as saying, quote, U.S. covert forces would get involved if the offensive fails to dislodge al-Shabaab, unquote, which is exactly what happened. So U.S. forces were involved, and then he went on to say, quote, what you're likely to see is airstrikes and special ops moving in, hitting, and getting out, unquote. And that's a huge clue to what's going on in Somalia, that's going on in countries all over Africa now. And I recommend a little plug for myself. I recommend my videos on AFRICOM, and any of my videos about the African region and the North African region and what the big picture is, because this fits in perfectly in a number of ways. One, the fact that the United States has an African command now, AFRICOM, and we're overseeing the entire African continent, have military presence in almost every country now, and also this new blueprint for conflict. And I have a video on that as well. The U.S. military, called Future Military, is here, and it talks about this new shift in strategy and tactics for the United States. And we're seeing it in action, because we're not going to be having declared wars. Instead, we're going to have these quasi-legal, layered conflicts where we're going to have a lot of spooks in there. We're going to have special forces. We're going to have drones. We're going to have airstrikes, surgical airstrikes. We're going to have lots of mercenaries / private contractors. And the bulk of this grunt work will be done by native armies. So, of course, the military-industrial complex will get their share of supplying arms for all these operations as well. And then the grateful victors in all of these African countries will be more than happy to work with transnationals and American oil companies. So that's another thing that we see in common here. So some other fun facts about Somalia, to wrap it up, is that not only do they have oil, but they have untapped reserves in uranium, iron ore, tin, gypsum, bauxite, copper, and natural gas, and probably substantial oil, as I mentioned. And the 80% of the population is nomadic, which is rather interesting as well. So that's quite a demographic factor that's unusual that Somalia has to deal with. And they're also the major supplier in the world of frankincense and myrrh, little known fact. And there's all, in spite of this entire environment that I described, oddly enough, there's General Motors and Coca-Cola have invested in open plants in Somalia. So it's not quite the destitute wasteland that I think a lot of Americans still picture, and I know I certainly have at different junctures. So so there we have it. The U.S. seems to be involved in a decade-long low-level war in Somalia, and our presence undoubtedly will increase there. So just a little heads up. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.